it seems like an endless cycle of violence. Afro-Americans oftentimes experience violence in their childhood. They grow up in broken families, and that's how you get the next generation of violent criminals who then abandon their children or traumatize their children, commit crimes, and that brings forth more violence. And then the next generation of violent criminals. Police and the justice system, they try to solve this problem with more violence. But the system has been designed in a way so that the underlying problems will never be solved. Police brutality and the unjust justice system, they give a lot of motivation towards gangsters and the whole gangster mentality. And then you have somebody dying in police custody, someone like George Floyd, and we see violent protests and riots. And even those left-wing demonstrations, they're peaceful. They ultimately aim to change the system. They want to establish a left-wing socialist-type government, and to that end, they would have to force the system. They have to force the system onto everybody, and of course, that would mean a lot of violence. So the right-wing political spectrum in the United States is cleaning its AR rifles, and they think there might be a civil war, or there might be at least a takeover of the generals and the right-wing part of government and the military. There might be martial law to suppress the left uprising, to put certain left-wingers into internment camps. But for a number of years, you saw a violent radicalization of Latinos. And so if the upper class, if the ruling class wants to play it that way, you would see Latinos fighting the right-wingers, for example. This is just a possibility. So we've seen this Reconquista movement to recapture the southern United States for the Latino sphere. In Europe, we see countries like France. They've been ruling for a couple of years with martial law light, these emergency rulings after some Islamic terrorists committed horrendous acts. In Europe, especially Germany, you saw this this refugee crisis, and you also saw a transformation of large cities, more crime. People are not used to this. So, left-wingers, they want a left-wing regime. Right-wingers, they want a right-wing regime. Right-wingers, they worship the Russian Putin regime, which uses all kinds of violence. And so we see this ongoing cycle of violence, or at least the threat of violence. And with this George Floyd character, we've seen, and I've talked about this in another video, we see that mainstream media wants to turn Floyd into a martyr, into an icon, and to that end, media has to manipulate his past, so they have to paint his past in a positive light. So, outside circumstances are blamed for his criminal activity, for his bad decisions. White racist America is supposedly has supposedly been at fault. But what about all the things that Floyd did, which continued this cycle of violence and poverty and misery? So he didn't really take care of his first two children. With a third child, he wanted to play daddy, but he didn't have a steady job and he was on drugs. Then he was convicted for his most serious crime that we know of. That was a an armed robbery and a break-in. A woman was pistol whipped in front of her small child. That might have been very traumatizing. This kid might be in danger for the rest of his life, to either be a victim more often or be a violent perpetrator later on. So we can only speculate how many crimes Floyd has actually committed that he was never caught for. So his homies from the hip-hop scene and the basketball team, his homies usually ended up getting shot, or they died from a drug overdose. Floyd was responsible for the security of some local rapper who was engulfed in this world of crime and drugs. We have to ask ourselves, did Floyd at some point go too far in his criminal career? Did he do something so horrible that he felt so guilty that he tried to become a Christian, and he just wanted to get right with the world? So maybe that was the reason he visited church at some point, and he tried to become sort of a moral preacher. You see the book Bleeding Out by Thomas Abt, and this book actually gives us some really interesting insight. So in the United States, all murders in 1 year cost an estimated $250 billion. So that means $10 to $20 million per murder. So you have the costs of the police and the justice system, the medical bills, the prisons, missed opportunities, missing out on employment, premiums that have to be paid, or increase in premiums for insurance, the loss of value of property in areas with high crime levels and murder rates. And that's just murder. You also have the costs for other violent crime. You get psychological damage in people. So it's a downward spiral. So why risk going to school if you meet dangerous people in school? Why build a business if you get robbed 10 times? Why not just party all the time, because you never know when your life might end? And so early exposure to violence means you have very, very limited social upward mobility. And so police tries to fight the gangsters. They try to meet violence with violence. And the upper class, the true ruling class, can manipulate the justice system and the police system, can design it in such a way that you always have a certain level of violent crime in society. So you have so-called murder capitals, and people who have money and who are educated, they leave those cities, or they leave those areas, and of course these areas then experience even more financial hardship. So if you focus on the most important criminals, and if you focus on the most important places, you can actually reduce violence, and you can save a lot of money, and you can free up a lot of productivity. If you didn't put a lot of people together in very tight spaces, if you didn't do that, you could also prevent a lot of violence. Then we saw Tom O'Neill's book on Charles Manson, his group of killers, LSD, and CIA research on violence. So this phenomenon of violence was very, very systematically researched. They used rats, they used humans to figure this out. Scientists discovered that confinement and overcrowding were leading causes of violence. And if you then add chemicals and drugs, you can absolutely increase this effect. So Charles Manson apparently was used as a live, real-world experiment. He was a like a lab rat that was shielded from prosecution for a long time. He was able to basically break his parole conditions. He was able to do all kinds of things and recruit people. He was always protected and observed. Very interesting book. I recommend you read this. So Manson programmed his cult members. He used long LSD sessions and his narcissistic propaganda. Manson himself was the victim as a child of many violent acts, a lot of brutality, sexual violence. He visited a lot of youth institutions, correctional institutions, and the wisdom at the time that was dictated from above was that children had to function almost like robots. They had to behave, they had to follow commands like robots, and if they didn't behave as intended, you had to beat the resistance out of them, and you had to scare them, and you would actually do them a favor with this sort of treatment. But what happened was these institutions became sort of these breeding grounds for violent criminals, very, very dangerous violent criminals. I mean, it's not very hard to create a psychopathic criminal. So CIA research was all around Charles Manson, and they studied the causes of violence, the effects of violence, and everything associated with that phenomenon. So even before these modern ghettos, these housing projects, even before they were created, it was perfectly clear to an elite case of scientists that this was not a good idea. This would cause a lot of violence. So then you saw contaminated drinking water, a lot of lead poisoning, and that may have been intentional. And you saw government complicity with cocaine importation to the United States. Cocaine then was transformed into crack, and now you have this large opium addiction epidemic, and you also have a meth epidemic. So, individual criminals, small gangs, small criminal groups, they, just like the larger groups, they ignore the law, they ignore the government's monopoly of force, but they have to live with the consequences of their own practiced system of justice and security. So criminals try to screw each other over, try to kill each other, and then causes these vendettas, and they go back and forth, back and forth. One act of revenge follows the next. This reminds us of very, very old societies a long, long time ago. And there's lots of collateral damage, especially concerning children. So you breed the next generation of violent criminals. So you have a epidemic of child sexual abuse, and apparently pedophile criminals become more sophisticated. They become more organized. They almost act in a quasi-intelligence agency way. They have their own technical infrastructure. They're using encryption all the time, and they get more and more sophisticated and more dangerous. So you get child sexual abuse, you get mobbing, you get treated badly by corporations, and it's a justice system which is so hyper complicated that you can commit felonies without even knowing, realizing, and this is why lawyers will always advise you to shut up and let the lawyers do the talking. Do not speak to police other than the most basic things, your identity and that sort of thing, because you might have actually committed something that you weren't even aware of, or these sort of things. So to protect oneself is extremely expensive, and this system favors those who have more money and better connections. So, yes, African Americans, they come out of this horrible phase of slavery. But what most people don't even know these days is that white folks, white people, white Middle European origin people, they used to be very close to slavery, or pretty much slaves, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They were farming slaves. And I would suggest that people read up on that. So there was a huge amount of slavery for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe. And the system at some point ended. In Russia, it never really ended, and then then you saw the switch into communism. So, so yeah, there's brutality all over. There's exploitation all over. And so, governments nowadays, they have modern tools like psychometrics, which can measure the personality structure of people. Many factors get into that. And also the internet behavior of these people. Software such as Palantir has already been used by police. Very effective, but only people at the head of Palantir, they really know what's in those algorithms. So theoretically, using software like this, governments could actually determine the level of violence in society. They can say it's supposed to be that much violence or that much violence. And you can adjust the violence to be at the level you want it to be. So the book Bleeding Out explains that science knows very well which factors need to come together for a murder to happen. Murders happen at predictable places. They are being committed by identifiable people. They're being triggered by behavioral patterns and behaviors that are very well understood. So, for example, in the year 2015, half of the murders in the United States with firearms happened in only 127 cities. Half of the gun murders happened in 127 cities. More than a quarter of murders happened in 1,200 city areas, which comprise roughly 1.5% of the United States population. So the people from these places, they would fit into an area of 42 miles long and 42 miles wide. In Oakland, 60% of the murders happened through a network of roughly 1,000 up to 2,000 people. So 0.3% of the city's population. Other large cities are very similar. Most gangs in the United States are actually very small. 20 to 30 men, they're not very organized. And only 5% of gang members commit the really, really serious crime. These kind of criminals, they usually have experienced violence themselves very early on. Oftentimes you see sexual abuse, or you see all these horrible institutions they spend time in during their childhood. So these people are very, very dangerous. In Boston, you saw 70% of all shootings in a 30-year period on just 5% of the city area. So yes, you can actually direct violence. You can't actually control the level of violence. That is absolutely possible. So, there was a study about Chicago, lots of shootings among African Americans. And the study showed that you could have prevented 63% or predicted 63% of those shootings just by analyzing the social circle of the people involved. Imagine what you can do with an algorithm. You see small gangs, they insult each other on social media, so-called cyber banging. So one group photographs itself in the territory of the other group. That also can be registered and measured by algorithms. So police officers, they have to quickly assess other people. They have to do profiling, all kinds of profiling. And you learn that during training, and you learn that while you're on the job later on. And it might look like racism sometimes, but it's usually profiling. So if you have high-risk people, a certain clothing, a certain time of day, a certain place, these people are suspect. So a law-abiding Afro-American from the middle class doesn't use fake money like Floyd did, George Floyd did. They're not sitting in their car on the driver's seat, high on meth, or under the influence of meth, and they're not arguing with police why they don't want to be detained. And there's lots and lots of law-abiding Afro-Americans from the lower classes, and even they want targeted police action against high-risk criminals. So, the upper class, the ruling class of the United States, can direct how many violent, dangerous criminals are out there. And it's interesting to see how many harmless people get locked up for small stuff, while real hard criminals often manage to slip through this net. Isn't that interesting? So there's a lot of pressure on police officers to make more arrests that result in convictions. So then police picks easy targets, people who are not very educated, who can't afford real lawyers, people where you can easily find evidence in their pockets or their cars, people who are easily provoked to further resist the police. Then, of course, you see dirty tricks from police officers. Frame people with drugs and weapons. That happens. And then you see this epidemic of plea bargains, plea deals. So you don't get your day in court. You don't get to have a real court case. You just get to pick either a lowered sentence now or a super stiff, super hard sentence later, if you wanted to go to trial. And police officers, they often feel that they have to present a threat, be a perceived threat to scare away the criminals. So, if an African American dies because of an African American perpetrator, the African American community often refuses to cooperate with police. Oftentimes, this is because snitches get stitches, because people who cooperate are becoming targets themselves. So, if an African American dies at the hands of white cops, you see these big riots and violent orgies, and then you see the left celebrating their revolutionary ideas, and that provokes the right-wingers, and then the political center feels provoked. And research shows police has to use the right amount of force in the right form against the right targets to enable security. You can't just decry violence and have lots of well-meaning wishes. And a lot of prevention actually works. So people always, in law enforcement and scientists, they usually often identify 4 categories of people who are able to shoot other people. So you get the wannabes, they want to belong to a gang. That's why they commit a murder. Then you have those people who are used to violence. Then you get the even worse category of people who have experienced violence themselves when they were children. And then you get the pure, oftentimes even genetic psychopaths, and they really, really like the violence. So even with high-risk people, you can still intervene, you can still change their lives, get them out of this criminal lifestyle. So if the police has a good relationship to a community, then you can prevent a lot of violence and you can lower the crime rates. So obviously the book by Thomas Abt, Bleeding Out, the book does not look at the hypothesis that the upper class actually directs violence and actually keeps a certain level of violence going intentionally. So in earlier days, violence was perpetrated openly. It was everywhere. It was direct. It was physical. Violence was considered the norm. Peace and quiet was pretty unusual. And this sort of situation had advantages for ruling classes, but also huge disadvantages. If you have too much direct violence, your society will be pretty much dead and not very productive. If there's too little violence, then society will become too much alive and too productive, and that becomes dangerous for the ruling classes. So the solution for modern rulers was to use violence more indirectly. So to let citizens commit violent acts against other citizens, and also using more psychological forms of violence. So in Western countries nowadays, you won't be condemned to death because you're accused of being a witch, or you insulted the king, or you insulted a certain religion. In the old days, you would have been publicly tortured and killed. Stuff we nowadays see from serial killers. You also can't be whipped in public because of some arbitrary transgression invented or on the spot by the ruling class. And this was a problem not just for African Americans during slavery. This was also a problem for Europeans and Russians for a very, very, very long time. White people were farming slaves, pretty much. So a lot has changed, but life can be really, really, really difficult for many people nowadays, still. So child sexual abuse is an epidemic, but government isn't really fighting that enough, even though security is one of the core purposes of the government. So when you need the police, it's usually not there, or the police comes too late. The justice system is hyper complicated, way too expensive, and usually you don't get what you deserve, or other people don't get what they deserve. Then you have a very, very high cancer risk once you reach or get near to retirement age. So then when you're not a taxpayer anymore, you get violently ill. You're being treated with toxic substances and dangerous radiations. So doctors, they know about the problems of conventional cancer therapy, but the doctors don't know what else to do. And getting cancer and getting treated for cancer can pretty quickly feel like a semi-public torture and semi-public execution in slow motion. Then we have more and more and more probable cases of vaccine damage with children. Children don't develop correctly, and there's all kinds of damage. It causes more problems, and these children get mobbed. They get bullied. One problem follows the next. So it's not so much the government anymore that uses violence directly against the citizens. Usually it's other citizens committing these violent acts. The state, the government, is sort of in the background, sort of in the shadow. So now we got the illusion of justice system and political choices. So of course, ideological groups, they accuse each other of being violent and evil, and the other group is intending a violent revolution and a violent regime. If your own group commits violence or considers violence, that of course is viewed as good and correct and fight for freedom or for whatever values people might talk about. So, once you had larger empires and larger societies, it became necessary to build a modern justice system and a police system to prevent all these endless vendettas between people and families and clans and groups, because these vendettas will use up too many resources. If you try to bring justice to a situation, but you're personally involved, that usually doesn't really work. You know, it's hard to be fair and objective. And so if you try to take matters into your own hands, that will trigger a violent response. Somebody will take revenge, and that goes back and forth, on and on and on. So, thus, the government monopoly on force was invented and created. So the government has the monopoly to do police work and lead the justice system. So these cops and district attorneys, they're not personally involved in these cases. So they're supposed to be fair, and it doesn't make much sense for a convicted person to try to take revenge against the monolithic government. So, but if we have such a monolithic monopoly structure, what stops this structure from actually prolonging the violence and keeping the violence going, and to manage it in a scientific manner? So, if you take violence, and if you take theft, and you just make it seem very legal and organized, then you'd call it politics. And it all seems very legit and serious. But even in politics, you have to identify dangerous individuals and dangerous ideas. You get people that are dangerous, or people who are even more dangerous. So we need a lot more education about these things, and much better communication. All kinds of media and all kinds of communications have been militarized. So a lot of what you see is little more than verbal violence against others and psychological warfare and these sort of things. Very rare to find an honest conversation in a productive conversation or even a productive discussion that actually leads somewhere. Social psychologists realize that groups can form around any simplistic, stupid idea. There's so many groups nowadays. It's so easy to start a new group, and it doesn't even matter what the group is about. It's just that we instinctively form groups. And once these groups have been formed, the members of these groups, they immediately exhibit this group favoritism, tribal signaling, tribal bias, and so on. So in extreme cases, people will overvalue the group higher than anything else. It doesn't matter how crazy the group is, how meaningless the group is. And usually if two or more groups fight about some topic or some question, it's usually not really about the question. It's not really about what's the more scientific, correct view. It's just usually it's just one group against the other. So we want to be part of something. We want to be part of a group. We want to have a status within our group, and we want our group to have a certain status in society. And to be in a group and to feel special, that must mean the group is exclusive, so certain people can't be part of that group. You need this group identity. We want to feel good in a group. And if this group has a high status, and if we have a high status within the group, we feel good. But if there's a problem with the status, we feel bad. And so a lot of times these conflicts between groups are just fights about your own self-esteem, your own self-value. And scientific questions are usually treated in a very manipulative way, very unscientific or very selective. What matters to most people is the tribal signaling. So people don't have a certain opinion because it's the most correct and because they have really looked at the science, but it's having a certain opinion is like a membership card. You're displaying your membership card. You're flashing your colors. You're flashing your sign. You're waving your flag. That's what these opinions are about. So the power of modern media, and especially social media on the internet, that power made it possible to signal, to do this tribal signaling even more, and more in a more pronounced fashion, more instant to signal, and it's gotten cheaper to signal. So, of course, it's creepy to think that facts don't really work on people. So politicians lie, people don't care they lie, and so people feel they have to have a certain opinion about something because that's their membership card. That's proof of loyalty to the group. And if you make a mistake in your peer group, if you have a difference of opinion, your membership is in question. So this group asks itself, can we trust this person still? Does this person still have the right values? But the problem is, there's too many groups, and there's too many stupid ideas. So, so you get more groups and more groups and more splinter groups, and they have their own identity, and they have their own ideas. And so, scientists realized that people usually go with their peer group, and what the group believes is more important than the facts. So it's more important for people to be a good, upstanding member of their tribe, more important to them than being actually correct. And people even consciously or semi-consciously accept being false, because they prefer to have a good reputation in their group. So social media has lowered the costs of uh, tribal signaling, and so we grow apart, but we can solve this problem. So it's important to realize, if you talk to somebody from a different group, it's important to realize that this is a person. This person has a family. This person has the hobbies and interests. It's a real, actual person. It's not just a little bit, a part of some group, right? And it's important to realize that not just does that person have biases and these sort of mechanisms, but you yourself have biases and these sort of mechanisms. So try to see others as humans and individuals, and try to find common ground, and try to explain where you're coming from. And there was a study that showed that people with a highly developed sense of science and scientific exploration and scientific interest, scientific people, they're not so polarizing, and they're not so polarized about topics. And the more they read, the more they understand, the less they agree with some of these dogmas and this group thinking. So even if you consider yourself a member of this group or that group, and you realize that your group has problems, and you realize that there's some seriously wrong things going on in your group, and there's some really wrong ideas in your group, or you realize that some ideas just don't work in the real world, or they only work for certain people, and but it's hard to speak out. It's hard to speak up because you don't want to lose your standing in the group. But there's also group thinking, and group narcissism also comes with a cost. There's a price tag, and this price tag can be really, really high, much higher than people realize. So people tend to see the value of group thinking and group signaling. They see the benefits, and they see the drawbacks. They can imagine the drawbacks if you go against the group. But what people usually don't realize is all the bad things that can happen to you, and all the money and opportunities you can lose if you stay within that group thinking. So maybe you don't find the partner of your dreams because you're in a certain group thinking. Maybe you ruin relationships or even family relationships because of group thinking. Maybe you miss out on great business opportunities because of group think. Maybe you study the wrong thing and you don't find a good job later on. Or you get into all kinds of problems because of group thinking. So people have a lot of opinions, but they rarely ever read books on the topics, and that's a huge problem. And we saw this with all kinds of topics, and we see this with the current riots, and we saw this with the COVID pandemic. So in Europe, you had communists. Who were starting to tank in the polls because of the pandemic, because people tend to think more conservatively if there's a threat like a pandemic. And people favor law and order, and they favor jobs over socialist experiments. So communists were losing in the polls. And then you saw communists in Europe declaring the pandemic to be a hoax and a right-wing capitalist conspiracy. And then you saw a lot of right-wing conservatives. They talked a lot about COVID being a communist conspiracy. Dangerous virus, but communist conspiracy. Then you saw the regular conspiracy crowd. They declared the pandemic to be a fake, a hoax, perpetrated by some by this big conspiracy. And then the political center, they tended to ignore all the mistakes that were made before the pandemic. There was many opportunities missed to prepare accurately for a pandemic, and then a lot of deaths resulted from lack of preparation. But people from the political center, they are afraid to attack politicians and structures from the center because it's their group, it's their tribe, and they don't want to go against their tribe, and they don't want to embolden or empower these other tribes they consider to be their enemies. And these are ways that people are being controlled, especially through various forms of violence and even threats of violence. So it can be very mentally taxing if you live in constant fear over a right-wing capitalist white world conspiracy, or you live in fear of a communist world conspiracy. There's only 3 superpowers left, and these 3 superpowers, they have way too much control over people. So yes, there are very large secret operations going. Don't get me wrong, but if you only have a limited picture and you expect the world to end next week all the time, that can be mentally very taxing. So it's kind of this looming doom, this looming threat of communist uprising and a civil war and all these things. And usually people are being strung along. Usually in the West, it's too dangerous to have for the ruling class to have any major incidents. So it's always just implied. It's always just bubbling below the surface, and it's always just threatened, but rarely ever perpetrated. Yeah. So please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment down below.